The moment someone laughs while you are being humiliated is the moment you learn who is truly on your side. That Thanksgiving began like every other one I had spent with the Mitchell family. The house smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh dinner rolls. Relatives filled every room. Children chased one another through the hallway, while football played quietly on a television in the den. From the outside, it looked like the kind of holiday gathering people post on greeting cards. Inside, it was something very different. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I was 43 years old that Thanksgiving, and I had been married to David for nearly 17 years. During those years, I learned how to smile through uncomfortable comments, overlook small insults, and convince myself that family harmony mattered more than my own feelings. Looking back, I realize I spent far too much time making excuses for people who never offered the same kindness in return. That afternoon, I arrived early to help prepare the meal. I set tables, arranged serving dishes, and helped organize desserts. Helen, my mother-in-law, supervised everything from the kitchen island like a manager inspecting employees. Nothing I did was ever quite right in her eyes. The napkins were folded incorrectly. The pie placement looked awkward. The gravy boat belonged on the opposite side of the table. I accepted the criticism quietly, just as I always had. By the time everyone sat down to eat, I was exhausted. Still, I smiled and did my best to enjoy the holiday. For the first half hour, everything seemed peaceful. People passed dishes, shared stories, and laughed at old family memories. Then someone complimented the homemade pecan pie I had brought. It was a simple comment, completely harmless. Yet somehow it became the spark. Helen smiled and took a sip of iced tea before speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. Well, Lauren has always been good at bringing desserts. It is easier than contributing real value to the family. The room became quiet. Several relatives looked down at their plates. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances. I felt my stomach tighten instantly. Then Helen continued. Honestly, if David had not married her, I doubt she would have the life she enjoys today. A couple of people chuckled nervously. Not because it was funny, but because they did not know what else to do. Those laughs hurt more than the words themselves. I looked toward my husband. David sat only 3 feet away. He heard every word. He saw every face turn toward me. For a brief second, I waited for him to say something. Anything. A simple sentence would have been enough. Instead, he lowered his eyes and reached for his water glass. That was it. No defense. No objection. No support. In that moment, surrounded by family, I felt completely alone. And as conversations slowly resumed around the table, something inside me shifted in a way I would not fully understand until much later that night. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the distance had not changed. Streetlights passed outside the passenger window in a steady rhythm while David focused on the road. The silence between us seemed to fill every inch of the car. I kept replaying the dinner in my mind. Not Helen's words. Not the nervous laughter from relatives. What stayed with me was the image of my husband looking down at his water glass instead of looking at me. After nearly 20 minutes, David finally spoke. Mom did not mean anything by it. I turned slowly and stared at him. Of all the things he could have said, that was the one he chose. She knew exactly what she meant. I replied quietly. David tightened his grip on the steering wheel. You know how she is. The sentence landed harder than he realized. I had heard it for years. Every hurtful comment. Every criticism, every holiday ruined by tension. The same excuse always appeared. You know how she is. As if understanding someone's behavior somehow made it acceptable. As if familiarity erased responsibility. When we arrived home, I carried leftovers into the kitchen while David headed upstairs to change clothes. The house was quiet. I placed containers in the refrigerator, washed a few serving dishes, and tried to settle my thoughts. Eventually David returned and found me standing at the kitchen sink. Lauren, he said gently, can we not make a bigger issue out of this? I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. A bigger issue? He sighed. It was Thanksgiving. Everyone was trying to enjoy themselves. I stared at him in disbelief. I was the one being humiliated. David rubbed his forehead. Mom is getting older. She says things without thinking. For a moment, I simply looked at the man I had spent 17 years loving. Then I asked a question that surprised even me. If someone spoke to your daughter that way someday, would you tell her not to make a bigger issue out of it? David opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Later that night, long after David had gone to bed. I sat alone in the living room with only a small lamp glowing beside me. The house was still. Outside, a cold wind rattled the remaining leaves clinging to the trees. I thought about every holiday, every family gathering, every moment I had convinced myself to endure for the sake of peace. One memory led to another. Small insults, dismissive comments, times when Helen questioned my decisions, my career, my role in the family. And every time, David chose comfort over confrontation. Looking back, I realized something painful. Thanksgiving had not broken my heart. It had simply revealed a truth I had been avoiding for years. The deepest wound was never Helen's cruelty. It was knowing that the person who promised to stand beside me had spent years standing quietly somewhere else. Over the next few days, I found myself doing something I had never done before. I started counting. Not years, not holidays, moments. Small moments that had seemed insignificant when they happened, but now appeared connected like pieces of a much larger picture. One memory led to another with surprising clarity. I remembered a family barbecue nearly 10 years earlier when Helen criticized the way I arranged the outdoor tables. Everyone laughed politely while I smiled and pretended it did not bother me. I remembered a Christmas gathering when she told relatives that David would have been more successful if he had married someone more ambitious. David heard it. He looked uncomfortable. Then he changed the subject. I remembered the time Helen questioned whether I was capable of managing our household budget despite the fact that I had handled our finances for years. Again, David remained silent. At the time, I convinced myself those incidents were isolated. Looking back, I realized they formed a pattern. The details changed. The outcome never did. Helen spoke. I absorbed the damage. David avoided conflict. One Saturday morning, while sorting old photographs in the guest room closet, I discovered an album from our early years of marriage. I sat on the floor flipping through the pages. There we were at a county fair holding giant lemonade cups. There we were standing beside a lake during a summer vacation. There we were smiling in front of our first home. For a few moments, I felt a wave of sadness. Not because those memories were bad. They were wonderful. The sadness came from realizing how much effort I had invested into protecting a relationship that often left me feeling unprotected. That afternoon, David found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at the photographs. He smiled when he saw them. I forgot about those, he said. I nodded. We looked happy. We were happy, he replied. His answer lingered in the air. Were we? Or had I simply become skilled at carrying burdens quietly? David sat across from me and began talking about work. A new project. An upcoming deadline. Normal things. As he spoke, I noticed something that had escaped me for years. He always became uncomfortable whenever conversations moved toward emotions. Practical problems he could solve. Emotional ones he avoided. That evening, after he went upstairs, I remained alone in the living room. Outside, holiday decorations still glowed on neighboring houses. Families laughed. Cars came and went. Life moved forward as usual. Yet inside me, something had changed. For the first time, I stopped asking whether Helen would ever treat me differently. I stopped wondering whether David would suddenly become the husband I needed him to be. Instead, I began asking a different question. What would happen if nothing ever changed? The answer arrived quietly. If nothing changed, next, Thanksgiving would look exactly like the last one. And the one after that. The realization was not dramatic. It was calm, almost peaceful. But deep down, I sensed that once a person begins seeing a pattern clearly, they can never return to pretending it does not exist. The conversation that changed everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. There was nothing dramatic about the setting. No holiday gathering. No audience. No raised voices. In many ways, that made it more important. David and I were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. A half-finished cup of coffee sat in front of me while he scrolled through emails on his phone. The house felt unusually quiet. For several days, I had been carrying a growing certainty inside me, and I knew I could not ignore it any longer. Can we talk? I asked. David looked up and set his phone aside. Of course. For a moment, I studied his face. The same face I had looked at across dinner tables, vacation cabins, hospital waiting rooms, and countless ordinary moments over nearly 2 decades of marriage. Then I took a slow breath. I do not think you understand how unhappy I have been. His expression immediately tightened. Not with concern, with discomfort. I recognized it instantly. Whenever emotions entered a conversation, David treated them like unexpected guests. "This is about Thanksgiving?" he asked. I shook my head. Thanksgiving was only the latest example. He leaned back in his chair. "Lauren, we have already talked about that." "No," I replied calmly. "We talked about Helen. We never talked about us." The room fell silent. David looked away first. That small detail did not escape me. For years, I had mistaken avoidance for peacekeeping. Now I saw it differently. "I need you to understand something," I continued. "This is not about one dinner. It is not about one comment. It is about 17 years of feeling like I come second whenever your mother decides she wants something." David sighed heavily. "That is not fair." I almost smiled at the irony. Fairness was suddenly important. "Is it not?" I asked softly. "Can you honestly remember a single time you stood up for me when she crossed a line?" He opened his mouth and then closed it again. Several seconds passed. The silence answered the question better than words could. Finally, David spoke. "I have always tried to keep the peace." There it was. The explanation that had guided so many of his decisions. "Keeping the peace for who?" I asked. He looked frustrated now. "What do you want me to do?" The question settled heavily between us. Not because it was cruel, because it revealed how little he understood. I did not want a dramatic confrontation. I did not want him to choose sides. I wanted him to recognize that protecting a marriage sometimes requires courage. Instead, he was treating my pain like a complicated problem he hoped would solve itself. I stared at the family photographs displayed on a nearby shelf. Birthdays, vacations, anniversaries, evidence of a life built together. Then I looked back at David. "I wanted you to choose us," I said quietly. He rubbed his forehead and shook his head. "You are overthinking this." The moment he spoke those words, something inside me became perfectly clear. Not anger, not heartbreak, clarity. I realized I had just given him one final opportunity to understand what was happening, and without realizing it, he had let it pass. Later that night, while David slept upstairs, I sat alone in the dark living room. For the first time, I was not wondering how to fix the situation. I was wondering what my life would look like if I stopped trying. After that conversation, I stopped waiting for a breakthrough that was never coming. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. I stopped imagining the perfect words that would finally make David understand what I had been trying to say for years. Instead, I started paying attention to something far more important. Reality. Reality was not what I hoped our marriage could become. Reality was what it already was. The following week passed quietly. David acted as though our conversation had never happened. He talked about work projects, weekend errands, and holiday plans. Every time he smiled at me across the breakfast table, I found myself wondering whether he truly believed everything was fine or whether pretending had simply become a habit. Meanwhile, something inside me was changing. Not dramatically, not all at once. It felt more like a slow shift in direction. One evening after work, I drove across town to visit a small apartment complex near the river. A coworker had mentioned that several units were available. I told myself I was only being practical, just gathering information, nothing more. Yet as I walked through a clean one-bedroom apartment overlooking a row of winter-bare trees, I experienced something unexpected. Peace. The rooms were modest. The kitchen was small. The furniture shown in the model unit was simple. But standing there, I felt lighter than I had felt in months. On the drive home, I kept thinking about that feeling. Over the next 2 weeks, I began making quiet preparations. Nothing dramatic. I opened a separate checking account. I gathered personal documents and organized them neatly in a folder. I reviewed my finances and created a realistic budget. Every step felt calm and deliberate. I was not acting out of anger. Anger fades. I was acting out of clarity. One Saturday morning, Helen called while I was folding laundry. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. She complained about a restaurant, criticized a neighbor, and made several comments about an upcoming family gathering. Before hanging up, she reminded me to bring one of my pies because, in her words, it was the contribution I was best known for. A few months earlier, the remark would have ruined my day. This time, I simply thanked her and ended the call. The difference surprised even me. For the first time, her opinion no longer felt powerful. That evening, David found me reviewing paperwork at the dining room table. "What are you working on?" he asked casually. I closed the folder before answering. "Just getting organized." He nodded and walked away without another question. I watched him disappear into the living room and realized something that made me unexpectedly sad. We had become experts at avoiding the truth. He avoided hearing it. I avoided speaking it. And somewhere along the way, distance had quietly replaced connection. A few days later, I signed the lease for the apartment. When I finished writing my name, I sat in my car for several minutes staring through the windshield. I expected fear. Instead, I felt relief. For years, I had spent my energy trying to convince other people to value me. Now I was finally making a decision that reflected my own value. And although nobody around me realized it yet, my life had already begun moving in a completely different direction. The morning I left looked completely ordinary. That was intentional. The alarm rang at 6:30. I got out of bed, made coffee, and followed the same routine I had followed for years. David came downstairs a little after 7 wearing a dress shirt and carrying his laptop bag. He poured himself coffee and glanced at the weather forecast on his phone. Rain was expected later that afternoon. We exchanged a few casual comments about traffic and work schedules. If anyone had walked into the kitchen that morning, they would have assumed everything was normal. That was the strange thing about major life decisions. Sometimes they arrive without dramatic music or emotional speeches. Sometimes they happen quietly while cereal bowls sit in the sink and coffee cools on the counter. After David left for work, I stood alone in the kitchen and listened to the silence. The house felt different. Not sad, not angry, simply finished. I carried my coffee into the living room and looked around at the space that had once represented the future I imagined for myself. Family photographs lined the shelves. Holiday decorations still sat neatly stored in a closet. Furniture we had chosen together filled the rooms. Yet for the first time, none of it felt like home. Around 9 o'clock, I began loading my car. I took only what belonged to me and what I truly needed. Clothing, personal documents, family keepsakes, a few books, photographs from my childhood. The process felt surprisingly calm. There was no rushing, no second guessing. Every item I packed represented a choice already made. By noon, most of my belongings were gone. The house looked almost unchanged, which somehow made the moment more emotional. 17 years of marriage reduced to several carefully packed boxes. Before leaving, I sat at the dining room table and wrote a letter. Not because I owed anyone an explanation. I simply wanted the truth to exist somewhere in writing. I explained that I was safe. I explained that I needed space. Most importantly, I explained that leaving was not about one holiday dinner or one argument. It was about years of feeling invisible, years of asking for partnership and receiving avoidance instead. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter where David would see it. Then I picked up my keys and walked toward the front door. For a moment, I paused. Not because I wanted to stay, because I wanted to acknowledge what was ending. I looked around one final time, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The air felt cool against my face. As I drove away, I expected tears. Instead, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Relief. Mile after mile passed beneath my tires while the familiar streets slowly disappeared behind me. By the time I reached the apartment, a light rain had begun falling across the city. I carried the first box inside, set it on the floor, and stood quietly in the center of the living room. The space was empty except for a few pieces of rented furniture and several unopened boxes. Yet standing there, surrounded by uncertainty, I felt more at peace than I had felt in years. Back at the house, David still believed he was coming home to the same life he had left that morning. He had no idea that by the time he opened the front door, I would already be gone. David called me 12 times during the first evening. I watched the notifications appear on my phone one after another while sitting on the small sofa in my apartment. Outside, rain continued tapping against the windows. Inside, the rooms remained quiet except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. I did not answer, not because I wanted to punish him. I simply was not ready to have a conversation that should have happened years earlier. By the following morning, he had left several voicemails. His first messages sounded confused. The next one sounded worried. By the end of the day, panic had begun creeping into his voice. I listened to them only once. Then I placed the phone on the kitchen counter and went about my day. Meanwhile, something very different was happening back at the house. For the first time in years, David was noticing all the things I used to do without being asked. The refrigerator was nearly empty because I was the one who tracked groceries. Bills that seemed to pay themselves were suddenly waiting for attention. Appointments needed scheduling. Holiday thank you cards remained unwritten. Small responsibilities that once appeared effortless now demanded his time and energy. None of these tasks were difficult on their own. Together, they revealed how much of our life had quietly rested on my shoulders. 3 days after I left, Helen called him. Later, he told me how the conversation went. She had invited him to dinner and immediately asked where I was. David explained that I had moved out. At first, Helen assumed it was temporary. A disagreement. A misunderstanding. A dramatic reaction that would pass in a few days. Then David showed her the letter. According to him, she read every word in complete silence. When she finished, she sat staring at the pages for several minutes. She left because of Thanksgiving? Helen finally asked. David shook his head. She left because Thanksgiving was not the first time. The answer apparently unsettled her. Over the following week, relatives began hearing pieces of the story. Some reached out to me directly. Others spoke to David. A surprising number admitted they had noticed Helen's comments over the years, but never said anything. Their honesty frustrated me more than I expected. People had seen the problem. They simply chose comfort over involvement. One evening, David arrived at Helen's house unexpectedly. He later described finding her sitting alone at the kitchen table. No television, no radio, just silence. For once, she did not immediately defend herself. Instead, she asked a question that lingered with him. Did I really treat her that badly? David told me that hearing those words felt strange because it was the first time his mother seemed genuinely willing to consider the possibility. The following morning, I walked along a riverside trail near my apartment. The air felt crisp and clean. Winter sunlight reflected across the water. For the first time in a long while, my thoughts felt clear. Back at the house, David and Helen were finally confronting truths they had spent years avoiding. And while neither of them knew exactly what came next, they were beginning to understand something important. The empty spaces I left behind were telling a story that my words never could. 2 weeks after I moved out, my phone rang while I was organizing books in the apartment. The caller identification displayed Helen's name. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Her voice sounded different from the woman I had known for years. Quieter, less certain. "Lauren," she said softly, "would you be willing to meet with me?" The request caught me off guard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I agreed. We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop halfway between my apartment and her neighborhood. The following afternoon, I arrived a few minutes early. The shop was warm and peaceful, filled with the scent of coffee and fresh pastries. When Helen entered, I immediately noticed something had changed. She looked tired, not physically exhausted, but emotionally worn down. She carried herself differently. The confidence that once filled every room had been replaced by something more fragile. Humility. We sat across from each other near a window overlooking a quiet street. For several moments, Helen simply stared at her hands. Finally, she looked up. "I owe you an apology." The words came slowly, as though she had practiced them many times before saying them aloud. I remained silent and allowed her to continue. "For years, I convinced myself that I understood you." She shook her head gently. "The truth is that I never tried." Outside, a few pedestrians passed beneath the winter sunlight, while traffic moved steadily along the street. Inside, the world seemed to narrow to the conversation between us. Helen took a slow breath. "After you left, I started hearing things from relatives. Stories I had ignored. Moments I barely remembered." Her eyes filled with regret. "I realized people noticed my behavior long before I did." I listened carefully. There was no defensiveness in her voice. No attempt to justify the past. That alone felt remarkable. Then she said something I never expected. "David showed me some of the things you handled for the family over the years." She smiled sadly. "I spent so much time criticizing you that I never appreciated everything you were doing." For the first time, I saw genuine sorrow on her face. Not sorrow because she had been caught. Sorrow because she finally understood the consequences of her actions. "I thought I was protecting my son," she admitted. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot he was building a life with someone who deserved respect." The honesty surprised me. For years, I had imagined what I might say if Helen ever apologized. Yet now that the moment had arrived, I found myself more interested in listening than speaking. Before leaving, Helen reached into her purse and handed me a folded letter. "I wanted to put it in writing," she said, "in case I could not find the right words today." I accepted it quietly. As we stood to leave, Helen hesitated. "I do not expect forgiveness immediately," she said. I only hope you know that I finally understand." Later that evening, back in my apartment, I sat by the window reading her letter while city lights flickered beyond the glass. For years, I had wanted Helen to see the truth. Now she finally did. Yet the most surprising part was realizing that her apology was not the thing I had been searching for. What mattered most was that I had finally learned to value myself enough to leave when staying meant losing pieces of who I was. Several months passed before David and I met face to face again. During that time, my life slowly settled into a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. I decorated the apartment. I built new routines. I spent weekends exploring parts of the city I had always meant to visit but never found time for. Most importantly, I learned what peace felt like when it was not dependent on someone else's approval. One Saturday afternoon in early spring, David asked if we could meet at a small park near the river. After some thought, I agreed. The day was bright and cool. Families walked along the trails while children played near a fountain. When I arrived, David was already waiting on a bench overlooking the water. He stood as I approached. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled sadly. "You look happy." I considered the statement before answering. "I am." We sat together for a while watching the river move beneath the sunlight. Eventually, David broke the silence. He told me about the months after I left. The empty house. The conversations with Helen. The difficult realization that avoiding conflict had created a much larger one. He admitted things he had never admitted before. He acknowledged the times he should have defended me, the times he should have listened, the times he chose comfort over courage. I appreciated his honesty, truly. But as I listened, I realized something important. The woman sitting on that bench was no longer waiting for those words. I had already done the healing work myself. After a long pause, David looked at me. "Do you think we can go back?" The question hung in the air between us. I glanced toward the river. Water continued moving forward without hesitation. Finally, I answered, "No." The word was gentle but certain. David lowered his eyes and nodded slowly. For the first time, he did not argue. He did not explain. He simply accepted the truth. Before we left, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note, a simple apology and a thank you. He thanked me for the years we shared and for teaching him a lesson he should have learned much sooner. As we said goodbye, I felt no anger, no bitterness, only clarity. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Helen. She wrote about the changes she had made in her own life. She wrote about accountability, humility, and regret. Most of all, she wrote about respect. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not because I needed it, but because it represented growth. Looking back, people often assume my story is about leaving. It is not. Leaving was only one decision. The real story is about finally recognizing my own worth. It is about understanding that love without respect cannot thrive. It is about learning that silence can be just as damaging as harsh words. Most importantly, it is about discovering that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from a life that asks them to become smaller. As spring turned to summer and the world outside my window filled with light, I realized I had not disappeared at all. The truth was exactly the opposite. For the first time in many years, I had finally found myself.